Cool. That's great. I'll throw this away. And just talk then a little bit more maybe about how we got started. And it sounds like maybe talking about some single horse work rather than teamwork might be more where you guys are at. That's certainly how we started. At this point, we're totally tooled up for a team. And 98% of what I do is teamwork. But we used to do it with a single horse. It's totally doable. There's a great Nordell's article about farming with a single horse. In Europe, it's like the standard. And here, partially because we had larger acreages, and partially because I think Americans are inherently lazy, when almost all the team equipment is riding equipment, so you sit and do it, and all the single equipment is walking equipment, and so you walk behind the horse. And I don't know, it's my pet theory that, like, yeah, in this country it was like, just get another horse, and then you won't have to walk. So there's totally tools available for everything you need to do with a single horse. If that made more sense, or if it made more sense to use your single drive. So as I talk, keep reminding me to give the single horse option for each of the things that I'll talk about. Say a little bit about the farm. So it's 40 acres. 20 acres is in woods. 20 acres is open. And the woods, we do some logging, but it's not really, we dreamed of integrating it into the farm more than we have. And I think in the 5-year plan, I hope when I'm giving this talk in 5 years, I'm like, there's all these cool relationships between them. But right now, honestly, I spend almost all my time in this other 20 acres that's open. And of that, about 4 is in vegetables, and then the rest is pasture and hay. I don't differentiate between them. I rotate between what the horses make their hay on, what they eat, based on the cycle. So vegetables is the main crop. The main is the bread and butter of the farm. Okay, that was a weird Mexican metaphor. We also do a lot of meat. And then hay is a major crop that we produce, but we don't sell it. The horses eat it all. And part of what I love about them, part of what got us into it, which was much more kind of like theory-based stuff than we had no horse experience when we started, was just the idea that they are the fertility engine of the farm. And so the fertility is being generated in these 15 acres of pasture, brought into the barn, fed to the horses, and it comes out in manure, it gets composted. 2 years later, that's what's growing the vegetables. And there's other additions. That would be a gross oversimplification of what's actually in our compost. We have lots of laying hens and meat birds. We have a dairy cow. And then the bedding is wood chips and straw, and most of which we try to produce. But certainly the horses are the biggest contributor to the fertility, and we basically have a closed system at this point, so that the only thing we're buying in for fertility is crushed limestone from a quarry like 45 minutes west of us, because we have naturally acid. I mean, everybody has naturally acid soils, especially in the hills, and because calcium is great for other things too. So yeah, and then in terms of what we grow and how we sell it, the actual acreage of cash crops each year is probably only about 2 acres. Then there's another acre that's in cover crop, and it's all these are rough numbers. I don't really know what the numbers are, and who cares really? It's small, but not that small. And so most of that gets sold through our farm store in the winter. So our focus is really storage vegetables. We started that way because when we started farming, we were just trying to feed ourselves. And if you're trying to do that, you start to think about things that you can eat for the 8 months out of the year when things aren't growing in the ground. And so that's always been a big part of what we grew. But when we started this, we had a whole diet CSA. So it was vegetables, meat, milk, cheese, bread, maple. It was a long list. It was really fun and great. And then we had a baby, and it was the hecticness of it stopped being enjoyable. So we opened a farm store that basically offers a lot of the same things, but without the pressure of having people pay up front and needing to have certain things every week. And we also wholesale root vegetables. And most of the business in the farm store, again, is from September, or, through the fall, winter, and spring. And that means that in the summer we can be out in the fields, really focused on growing and keeping our energy in that place, and then switching into sales mode once the harvest is complete. So some of what I'm going to talk about also in terms of the way we lay the field out. I think most of the equipment would be the same if we were doing summer vegetables, but a lot of the rotations and the methods that we're using are based on, as you'll see, the fact that a lot of our crops are later planted crops that are meant for storage. And we're not doing a lot of early plantings. And we're not doing a lot of quick rotations during the season of greens, for example. Although we also did a farmer's market this year, and we did do a ton of greens. And part of the reason I'm not going to do farmer's market next year is the layout for those greens doesn't lend itself to the horses in the way that single rows of larger crops do. And you'll sort of see why as I go.
How long have you been doing this?
We started in 2000. Right, I forgot. Different talk. Let's do how we got into it. We started at this farm in 2010, and we interned on some other farms, I think, for a year or two before that. And then for 2 years before that, we were in Pennsylvania on some family land. So my wife and I were living in New York, left our jobs and the city and moved to this piece of family land in Pennsylvania and started just growing for ourselves. Not knowing if we were going to like it or anything, just kind of looking for a change and definitely a growing interest in nutrition and soil health and all that kind of stuff. And then once we knew we did like it, it was like time to work at other farms and learn how people actually farm. And the closest organic farm was run by this couple called the Nordells, who, after you leave this, almost anything I'm going to say they've written about in the Small Farmers Journal, which is a really great resource for all horse farming things. And their articles in particular, they just are so careful and thoughtful. They're tweaking their system every single year, and they're blessed with the ability to be with just tremendous clarity in how to explain this in their writing. And you can actually mail them a check directly, and they'll send you like a thing of all the stuff they've ever written in a video, which is totally worth like $30 or whatever. They're really great. Of course, this, horse farming knowledge was conserved in the Amish community, but in terms of the non-Amish, the Nordells have been just huge. They're probably in their 70s now in putting this information out there. So I don't know anybody who's farming with horses who's my age whose system isn't roughly based on the Nordell system. And that's, we all owe them a lot. By luck, they were the closest organic farm, which was still 45 minutes away from where we were in Pennsylvania. And so just kind of randomly, we were like, oh, maybe, some people farm with horses, it seems like. They have the best looking stuff at the farmer's market. And then through another random chance, the woman who had Hillary's job at this literary agency in New York before Hillary also left to start a farm called Essex Farm in Essex, New York, which is also horse-powered. And that was just a connection that we had, so we called her and went to visit that farm and ended up interning there. And then we worked at two other farms, both of which used tractor. One was all by hand, one was tractor. So when we started our farm, we were so ignorant that we really thought that there were like two viable choices. Like some people farm with horses, some people farm with tractors, you can choose. And we're like, oh, well, I'm not great at like fixing machinery, and I love animals, and it seems like the environmentally like better choice, so I guess we'll just do the horse thing. We actually didn't know. And then soon after we started, we were like, oh, we can't find equipment anywhere, and can't find any horse farmers anywhere, can't find... I don't know, I think there's only like 2 or 3 horse-powered farms in Massachusetts, production farms in Massachusetts. One of them is David Fisher, who lives like 45 minutes north of us at Natural Roots, and he was really helpful to us when in the crazy early days when we were like, what are we doing? So someone gave us a couple farms over, gave us a free horse who probably had some training in her life, but had been like out with the beef cows for some number for 12 years or something before we got her. Misty, she still is my favorite horse we've ever had. We like had a very difficult relationship to begin with. And we always did. We just sort of, we fought each other and loved each other a lot. And I'm so lucky to have her as my first horse. I wouldn't necessarily recommend people starting with free horses to begin with. But, for us, it was a low-cost way to see whether it was going to work before investing in it. Like the current team we have, they were 3 and 4 when we got them. They were trained by a friend of ours who's unbelievable. They were like almost $10,000, I think, for the team with harness. So that gives you, we weren't going to put that money down when we moved to the farm, hoping that it worked out. And with Misty, the system was quite different. And I think single horse work is always going to be a little bit sloppier. I'm going to describe why later, because I think it'll make more sense later as I go through some more of this. So, what else should I tell you? Our soil, the soil is really important to think about. That your equipment choices really depend on your soil, and I always knew this theoretically, but I never experienced it really until this year. My dad has a place 1.5 miles from our farm, and I opened up a half acre, or we plowed a half acre at his place to do hemp this year. We got a license for hemp and couldn't grow it on our place because it's an APR, blah, 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 blah. So we had to do it over there. It's in an old oxbow, and it's pure sand on gravel. It's much like Hadley soils or whatever. Our soil has tons of rocks. We go through every single year and we pick everything that's fist size or bigger. If you tried to go smaller than a fist, it would be like, a Sisyphean task. And there's a fair amount of clay in it. I've read a lot of stuff about geology and it won't stick in my brain, so I can't really tell you about soil types because it just flows right out the back of my head. So I thought we had a clay soil, and then a friend of mine who's a geologist brought his college class to visit the farm and do some soil samples or whatever, and he was like, "This is a sandy loam. There are really very few clay soils in Massachusetts. Their soil's not old enough." I've been walking around being like, "We have a clay soil for like 8 years or something." So it's not a clay soil, but it has a decent amount of clay. It holds water very well. We do sometimes irrigate, but our biggest problem usually is too much water. And the way our soil moves and versus the way my dad's soil moves is so different that I needed to adjust a bunch of my attachments and really do a number of things differently. And so, only to say, I guess, take everything I'm going to say would need to be adjusted based on soil type in terms of, maybe not the basic layout of the tools I use, but certainly the attachments that you would put on there. And when you might perform different tasks would definitely change based on whether, what type of soil you have. If you don't know what type of soil you have, just like I don't know, I run drip tape with little emitters every 12 inches or so. And I bury it, and I'll show you how we do that. I bury it about 3 or 4 inches deep. On my farm, when I do that, if you leave it on for 6 hours, the whole bed top is like evenly wet because the soil particles are fine enough that there's a lot of moisture wicking horizontally and even up. Whereas at my dad's, you would see a little spot of wetness every 12 inches, but the water was basically going straight down and out. Because of the large soil, the particle size, there's just room to. So, I don't know which soil is better. I really like ours because there's a lot of nutrient retention in it. There's just so much more particles, like surface area on these small particles. And so I find that when I put fertility down, it tends to stay in that soil. Whereas at my dad's, when I go back in spring, I expect to find basically no fertility left. Do you have a question?
Is that because he doesn't have horses on his property, or just because of just the geographical differences?
That soil type. So if you picture, if you imagine you're the size of an ant now, his soil, all those chunks are going to be like the size of your arm. My soil, the actual structure of it, the tiny pieces of soil themselves are so small. There's just a lot of surface area for nutrients to bind to. Whereas in that sand, you can imagine just pouring water on a beach. Things want to flow down. There's just a lot of like rapid downward movement of nutrients. But yes, also it's because I haven't been managing that soil for as long. So we have much higher organic content on our farm. It's been 10 years of working to make that soil what it is. But right from the get-go, I would say the nutrient retention was going to be better at our place, just because of the soil size. Yeah, that was a lot about that. Okay. And so our rotation. Questions about soil? We divide our crops into, and this comes from the Nordells also, they divide their crops into early, middle, and late. We don't really do early crops. We did some when we had this CSA because we were like pushing to get greens early and whatever. But, our season is so short, and we're only half an hour from Northampton, which is like 1,000 feet lower and 8 degrees warmer on average. We're never going to compete for cherry tomatoes, for red peppers, for, summer stuff is just not going to be, we're never going to be in the wholesale market for it, for sure. And even within our town, coming to our farm store, a lot of those people work in the valley, and so they can pick up sweet corn 2 weeks earlier from the valley than they can from us. So we've moved away from early planting. So when I say early, I'm talking about late May going into early June. And so I plant alliums first because they're a little more tolerant of cold weather. But it's really only like a week or two before I would be planting Solanaceae, tomato family crops, which are very sensitive to frosts. So there's really that planting burst early on, and then there's a later planting burst for storage crops in late June. So the rotation looks like this. There's these early crops, which is alliums. We do a lot of field corn that we grind for cornmeal, and we make tortillas out of. We sell a decent amount of it, but that's something that I would love to increase in the coming years. Cucurbits, which for us, again, is mostly winter squash, not cucumbers, for example, and Solanaceae, which in that family for us, again, is mostly potatoes, because that's a storage crop, and a lot of paste tomatoes for canning, but again, no beefsteaks, for example. That turns the section that planted early crops last year. This year we'll have late planted crops. So that's in the brassica family, mostly cabbage, but also broccoli, kale. We do a lot of carrots for wholesale. It's one of our main things. And so all of these early crops will be undersown to clover. Undersowing is when you come through after the crop is nicely established. So basically anytime from early to late July is a decent planting winter. You come through with a hand-cranked seeder. And for all of these things, that clover drops on the ground, comes up in the shade of those crops, and by harvest, should form a continuous mat. So it actually looks like you're growing these crops in a lawn all of a sudden. It's all, white clover is the safest bet if you want to start, but it's worth experimenting with lots of different clovers. But Dutch white clover is just low growing and the least aggressive of these clovers. And it's going to die back in winter, but it's going to come back immediately in spring. And so just really helping put nitrogen back in your soil and keep everything covered over the winter. So that's year 1. This is year 2. And year 3 would be fallow. So the cabbage also lends itself nicely to clover. Things in that family tend to get tall enough, so this is also undersown clover. These are small-seeded, so these get transplanted mostly. These are really small seeds that, take forever to germinate. They're really not competitive. I really can't sow clover there. It takes them long enough to get established that if I tried to put clover in August, for example, it just wouldn't take. There's not enough time for it to put down roots. It's going to, be a kind of weak growth. And actually getting it's not going to compete with weeds. So now I'm just going to be growing kind of weeds and clover. And so what I need to do is take these out and sow winter rye. And I usually get a very poor stand because I'm doing it late. And I'm distracted. And that's the weakest part of my system. And I'll talk about what I might do about that later. Can we just stop that? Maybe not. So, in this 3rd year, both of these cover crops go to bare fallow, which means for anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, it's empty. There's nothing growing there. I let weeds come up, and I go through and harrow once a week. And that tears them up and really, really helps reduce the weed population coming back into this sequence. Bare fallow is problematic with erosion. You don't want to overuse it, but it has a real place to my mind, in an organic system, and where you're trying to minimize weeding labor through the rest of your growing time. And that bare fallow will last until I sow oats and peas in early August. And my oats and peas, right now, well, now we have snow, but by the time they die back, these are winter killed, but they're frost tolerant. So they're going to persist through, let's say, the end of October, beginning of November, and finally, temperatures in the teens will kill them. But, I'll have a nice, solid stand of oats and peas that's basically waist height. And it's going to look like, this spring, it's going to look like I mulched this entire thing with straw. This is the real soil building. I mean, the clover is great and it adds nutrients. It's much better than not having it. But this is, to my mind, this is a really key piece of why our soil is as vital and alive as it is. This just provides a lot of food for microorganisms. Enough said. Does this make sense, more or less?
Do you harvest the oats and peas at all, or just?
I don't. I have tried. I really like having this material go back into the soil. So if I was going to do that on a large scale, I would just have to shift things around so that I planned it, and I might keep it out of that rotation. I might need to add extra manure. I often, if I have a decent stand of winter rye here and not a lot of weed competition or weeds going to seed underneath it, I will often harvest this for straw for bedding, which is really nice. That feels great to be able to. And so, yeah, in some future world, if I had a little more land, I might have a 4th year, so 2 years in fallow, and that 4th year might grow winter rye in a really clean soil specifically for straw. And then the way that this actually looks in the field, I farm on a steep slope. So that's the sort of outline of the field. And my rows are not straight. They follow the contour of the slope so that I don't get erosion. So you think of these rows almost as terraces, and I'll show you how I make them. But this row is going to be garlic, and I use garlic as my guideline for where my next rows go because it's the only thing that comes up in spring. And I then start planting just below that. I just move down. Every row that gets planted is just the next row down. So garlic is an allium, so I start with alliums. So this next row is going to be onions and more onions. And then I'll get into corn at some point. And now I'm in cucurbits and solanaceae. I've got my brassicas. I keep going until I've reached the bottom. I come back up and start planting up here. And now, let's say everything's been planted. What's left is fallow. And, my early stuff is in here. My late stuff is here. And maybe it wraps around up to here. And the following year, and I'll put garlic. So this is 2019 planted garlic here, let's say. Next year's garlic will be the last row. And in 2021, I'll start planting here. So that fallow will have my early crops in it now. My late crops will be here, and the fallow will be down here next year.
That's such a great...
Does that make sense?
Sounds like it works well.
Yeah. Now, having said that, there's so many exceptions and frustrating little things, and like one of the reasons I was saying I wanted to drop the greens successions that I was taking to farmers market is like they didn't work in this system because they would come out too soon, or I would reseed in that bed and then they'd be in too long, and I couldn't cover crop properly. So now I'm like doing a few rows, and then I have to change. I was like, oh, but I can't keep undersowing clover here because I've got arugula that's coming up that I need to sell in 3 weeks, and so. There's always frustrating, like this makes it look sweet, and you need to have a plan. And also, if you come visit the farm, you will see that there are necessarily some exceptions to this rule. One of the things I didn't talk about is like harvest lanes. So you sort of have to think about like if you're going to be harvesting thousands of pounds of paste tomatoes in late August, early September, what can you plant them next to that's going to be gone by then? And maybe it's something that's not in the solanaceae family. You wish it was, but it can't be. The corn, you have to think about what it's going to shade. So I don't actually put it right below the alliums. I might leave a couple blank rows, or I might actually put the corn. Anyway, so it goes on. So it looks more elegant than or it seems more elegant than it actually is. But this is essentially what I... So this whole thing would be like 3 acres.
Okay.
And then we have another smaller garden over here that has a different rotational system because it's for mostly stuff for us. It's a very similar rotational system. Instead of early and late, maybe I'll say this actually because it might be more relevant for smaller scales. Instead of early, late, fallow, I just have crop, fallow. And I don't worry about the timing. I just have... half of that area is not growing anything in any given year, and half of that area is. And then the following year, I swap. And I don't worry anymore about family, about trying to keep, you're supposed to not plant, if you had carrots, you're not supposed to plant carrots there for 3 years. I don't worry about that anymore. I think with a really rich soil, the swapping year to year, it just doesn't seem to matter. I just don't have any problems that are related to that. Anyway, so a sort of simpler way to think of that kind of really simplifies things if you're just like, oh, I have half of it I plant, half of it I don't plant. What I actually do there, on that piece, let's say this is fallow. That doesn't work. 235. I think we're good. If this is fallow, in year 1, I will plant my crops starting here. So I go down. When I come back, the following year the crops would grow up here. When I come back to this section 2 years later, right, I just plant my crops in the other direction. And that tends to keep the families sort of separate, if that makes some sense. So, you know, if my early scallions are up here in year 1, they're going to be down here in year 3, because year 2 they will have been up here. Am I doing a bad job here? No? Does that actually make sense? I'll move on if it does. Great. This might be a simpler way to get started if it's not for you know, large production. Large makes it sound like this is, but if selling thousands of pounds of vegetables is not the goal, if like eating is the goal, then this is probably the way to do it. It just takes a lot of the like fussiness out of it. And I can't stress how helpful the fallow is for weed control and for soil building. Okay, cool. So here's how the year starts in terms of work. For each section, regardless of what I did, except the bare fallow is its own thing, but anywhere that a crop is getting planted, I'm going to start by disking. That light is so annoying. Can we just turn that off? Doesn't matter. So discs, does everybody know what discs are? Or should I say what discs are? Yes, kind of. Plates, they look like a dinner plate made out of steel, so they're concave, and they throw soil. You can think of them almost as mini plows, but mine are 5 feet wide. Most discs that you're going to find are called double gang discs, meaning the first set of plates is curved and throws soil in, and the second set of plates, the first set throws soil out, and the second set throws soil in. Horses can't pull that. I mean, a big hitch of horses could pull that, but in general, you're going to see single gang setups for horses. And I will say, with a single horse, this was a big problem. I couldn't have her I couldn't have her pull the types of discs that you can generally find. But I randomly came across a set of discs that was made for a lawn tractor, I don't even remember what they're called. When I say lawn tractor, I don't mean like a small Kubota. I mean like a really little, it's like that big, and you sit on it. If you look in junkyards and stuff, you can find these things. And so this was a set of discs. It's probably only that wide. It would drive me nuts it would take me like weeks to do that. But if I was doing a half acre, I don't know, you could do it. And a single horse certainly could pull it, and it wouldn't be a problem. So that exists for single. I never used it because I didn't have that at that time. Also, Pioneer, I think, equipment sells discs that you can mount on another piece of equipment that they have. And my guess is that it's not so great. It's one of those like too many tools in one. You get a multi-tool and you're kind of like the can opener sucks and the knife sucks. And now you have them both on one tool and neither one works. That would be my guess about the Pioneer, but I could be wrong. I don't know many people who have that piece of equipment, so I don't have any personal experience with it. So for me, I'm using discs on a 4-cart. With a hitch pin. A 4-cart is a cart that goes for the other implement that's attached to the back of it before it. And so all it is 2 truck tires with an axle and a pole for the horses to stand on either side of. And then just a little piece of welded steel on top of it that you can stand on. And then it's got just like a receiver like you would have in the back of the truck. It's got like a receiver hitch in the back, so you can drop a pin in it. And any tractor equipment now that gets pulled, not like 3-point hitch tractor equipment, but any like pull type tractor equipment, all of a sudden you can buy and hook onto your forecart, which means, if you want to define horse-drawn discs with the pole and set up in that whole way, it's much harder to find than finding just pull type discs, which tons of them still exist from farmers, who use them all through the 70s and even into the 80s on smaller farms.
Did you make this yourself then?
This forecart I didn't make. Someone else made it, and I bought it. It's certainly a homemade job. I made one that's quite similar, but it's more for logging. If you can weld, you can make one. You'd want plans. Where I struggle with equipment that I build from scratch is with balance. So if there's too much weight in the back of it, the tongue will pop up and hit your horse in the face. And if there's too much weight on the front, it's just a seesaw at that point because there's two wheels. If there's too much weight in the front, it's really pulling down on the horse's neck a lot. So you want to be able to stand between, the two horses are here. I want to be able to stand here and lift the pole with not much effort. It shouldn't be like, ugh. But I don't want to touch the bottom of it and have it pop up either. And so for something like a forecart that you're going to be using a ton, it's probably worth trying to find one. And they're fairly inexpensive. It's nice if it has a hitch receiver that also takes a ball, because now you can put trailers or anything else on it. So this becomes just it goes in front, it becomes a piece of equipment that just a lot of other things can get stuck onto, and it's just easier to find things that use a pin hitch, the drop-in pin hitch, than it would be to actually find that piece of equipment made for horses. And there's totally companies that sell new ones that are really nice, and also if you poke around, a lot of farms will still have them around, or the pulling horse people have these, so it's a totally findable item, and it's pretty cheap if you get one that's used. I think mine was $200-300 Wait, what was I going to say? I was going to say one other thing about that. What was it? And they make forecarts for single horses. And so instead of a pole that comes out in the middle and one horse stands here and one horse stands here, it's got two arms basically that come around, which would just be like a, what's it called? For riding, like a cart of a sulky. There we go. And so Pioneer actually is now making almost all of its equipment so that there's a receiver that either takes a pole or takes the thing that I'm blanking on what it's called. The single horse thing.
The sulky, I don't know.
Sulky. And then sulky is like a riding thing, a thing that you ride on. Well, anyway, who cares? There's a word for that.
Is it traces? Is that there? Or is
No,
that
the traces is what they pull, is the thing that gets hooked up.
Yeah.
So that they actually pull. Anyway, Pioneers definitely has the market of single horse, small scale stuff in mind. And so while they also make giant equipment for 6 horses for Amish farmers with big farms, they're also doing homestead equipment that's really appropriate for the homestead. It's expensive. I mean, there's a lot of steel and machining that goes into it. So the downside to all this is do you want to spend that money and then hope that you use it and it works? That I leave up to you. So disking. So disking is, I do very little plowing now. I sometimes plow. I have a plow. But in general, I disc either the oats and peas because they're already dead. So I'm just sort of chopping it up so that it's not long strands of straw in the field. Or I'm disking this undersown clover. And I do that before the clover is really well established. I used to try to let the clover grow as much as possible so it could put more nutrients into the ground. But it's just a fight to get rid of it, and then that clover is breaking down and actually tying up nutrients while your new seeding or transplants are just when they're kind of wanting to spread their roots out and get those nutrients. So it can take the clover, like, say it takes 3 weeks to break down more or less. If you wait and do this in mid-May, the nutrient tie-up lasts into early to middle June. Probably mid-June, just because the soil temperatures aren't there for the rapid breakdown. So I basically get out there as soon as I can, as soon as the soil's dry enough, and disc the undersown clover. So that, and if you get it early like that, it's pretty easy to kill. You should be able to get it in one disking, and you certainly can get it with 2 diskings. That gets followed by manure. And for that, I have, again, the 4-cart with a hitch pin. And they totally make small spreaders that a single horse could pull. It's really a tough pull, but doable. And you can find, they're called ground-driven rather than PTO-driven. So the wheels themselves are turning the chains that turn the apron that pulls the manure back and spins the spreading mechanism as it goes. And those are available on the market. And yeah, I feel like if you're farming with horses, it would be sort of silly not to have one of these, because the whole part of the joy is they produce manure and they can spread it. So that gets spread once I'm pretty comfortable that the cover crop is chopped up and ready to go. The manure gets spread on top of it, and then I come through with a harrows.
And how aged is your manure then before it's spread?
So we have another topic. So when I was 31, so 6, 7 years ago, I hurt my back, not in a horrible way, but enough. And I was like, it's time to have some power on this farm that can lift things up and down that's not my back. And so we really talked for a long time about whether we were going to do tractor or skid steer. And the tractor was cheaper. The tractor was obviously more versatile. And the tractor also, I felt like, was going to eat the horses alive. Because if I had the option when I'm really busy in spring to run out and just do a quick thing, I was just I don't think I had enough willpower to not do that. I know people who do. I know people who have tractors and horses, and they love the horse work so much that they're really just committed to making sure the horses get out and get the work they should get and stay well trained. I just didn't think that we were going to be disciplined enough for that. And so we got a skid steer, which has lots of other advantages. Really maneuverable in the barn and in the barnyard. And so it's great for turning compost. It's better than a tractor. I mean, you can turn compost with a tractor for sure, but it's better and faster. It's really nice for moving hay and bedding around. And then also when we come down, when they pull the wagon down from the field after harvest, everything's in these pallet bins, and the skid steer can lift them off and put them in storage, which is how I hurt my back. Was moving everything frantically and in the middle of the night. Thousands of pounds of vegetables that I was afraid were going to freeze and shuffling everything around. So now you can just you lift it up and you put it where it's going. So we're not entirely horse-powered. What question was that answering?
How aged is the manure?
How aged is the manure? So now I can turn the manure. It used to be we were mucking out the barn by hand, and the answer was I just had to let it sit there until it was kind of ready. And at this point, we flip it multiple times, and so the bedding that's down now is going to get stacked in the spring when the animals leave the barn, and then it will sit there over winter, and it'll be spread the following year. So it's in a pile for 1 year, and it's down in the barn doing a fair amount of decomposition. Not at this time. Well, now it's 50 degrees for some weird reason, but even once we hit April, that starts to really heat up and start composting on its own, or even a little earlier than that probably. Yeah, and at that point, it is fairly well broken down. It's not perfect, but to my mind, it's not worth leaving it for another year. And I get the heat.
So you're turning the bin a couple times a year, or
I'm turning it. Sorry, so I'm turning it between the animals leave the barn in May, and the manure gets spread basically a couple weeks later. But that manure was from the previous year. So it's 1 year old, and it probably gets turned once or twice a month during the warm season. So I would say it gets turned or just moved. I don't so much turn it as I just like move the pile from one corner of the barn to the other. I probably do that 8 times, something like that. And I'm just waiting to really see everything get covered in mycelia and just steaming hot to kill weed seeds. Yeah, but I'm not against. I mean, there's some. So with the another thing I hated about the salad greens, I'm really trying to use well rotted. That's growing that close to the soil surface. It's early in the season, and they're splashback, and I really needed super well rotted compost for that I had to just think about and sort of plan separately. Versus the rest of these crops that we're talking about, I mean, you could spread fresh horse manure on any of these crops, and you'd be fine because these don't get planted until much later. So if you spread it in May, and this isn't getting to planted till late June, and it's not getting eaten for 3 more months, there's tons of time for that to break down in the soil. You don't have to worry about it. Versus arugula that gets planted in mid-May and is being consumed 3 weeks later.
Can I ask you
Yeah,
more
please.
about composting? I had that same question, but I was also wondering, are you incorporating food waste and just vegetable waste and everything into your compost, or is what you're spreading in the fields just strictly the horse manure?
It's everything. I'm into I want my compost to be as diverse as possible. It's mostly bedding. I mean, ingredient number 1 is wood chips. The reason I like wood chips is they feed fungal life, which is really important. They also persist in the soil for a long time. I wouldn't necessarily do this to start a new piece of ground because it will tie up nutrients because it breaks down over the course of a few years, that wood chip. Once your nutrition is up, though, the manure I'm spreading is somewhat feeding that year's crops, but it's mostly just keeping fertility up. And so I could probably not spread any manure at all this year and have yields that were basically comparable. But, it's a constant, slow feeding. So I really like wood chips for that reason. We can also produce a lot of them when we log. We pull the whole top of the tree out and we chip it. But this year I just lucked out and they were doing a lot of line work on my road, and so I just took all those wood chips, giant amount of wood chips. Straw we use for bedding. We don't use it for the horses because they'll eat it all. But the dairy cow gets heavily bedded with straw, and the chickens get bedded with straw. A big source of fertility for us is we did 750 meat birds this year. We do them when all the animals are out of the barn. It's a big 4,000 square foot barn with the south wall is totally open. So it's like being outside without having predators eat them constantly. So 750 meat birds is a lot of manure. So that's a big part of the fertility that's in there. And I'm actually not going to do this coming year, and we're going to see what happens to my fertility without that. But there's also 100 laying hens, so that gets in there. And then, tons of food waste. Anything I can get. I also have compost that I collect at the farm store, so people know what not to put in there, which is not much. I just don't want ho-hos and ding-dings and that kind of thing. But meat is great. Any meat that's not raw chicken, I love to feed to the chickens. They love to eat it. Anything they don't eat just stays on the bedding. And so my bedded by spring, there's going to be the whole 4,000 square foot barn is going to be that high with manure and bedding and waste and whatever. So I don't clean anything during the winter. I just keep adding stuff on top. And so you get some nice decomposition. It's called a bedded path. You get some nice decomposition going on in there. It's also nice and warm for the animals when they sit down. The temperature of the surface of that is actually like 50 degrees. So pretty pleasant for them. And also just means I'm not needing to move material around until everybody's out of the barn. And I come in with a skid steer and scoop it all into a giant pile. The other thing I do is spread lime in fall. Before everybody comes into the barn, I put down a thick layer of wood chips everywhere, and then I put down, however much lime I want, given that I think I have 3 acres in production. So, at this point, I'll do like a ton to the acre. So there's 3 tons of lime, kind of roughly spread over and mixed into these wood chips, and it just saves me a step having to spread lime later. And I think it also, having that lime be in there during the composting process, I have read will help keep nitrogen from escaping as ammonia. It tends to trap it. And also you have to imagine that it's getting broken down. The lime is getting broken down is more accessible when I spread it on the plants. And then the only other thing I have to do, because it's undercover, which is nice, if you can avoid doing this outside where a lot of nutrients are going to leach away, you should. But that means I actually have to water it. I have to keep it. I put hundreds of gallons of water on it to keep it nice and wet so the bacteria can do their thing.
In the pile when it's outside of the barn?
The pile's actually in the barn because there's not much going on in there during the not winter season. So I can just keep, the pile's still only, it reduces to 1/3 of its initial volume. So it might be, I don't know how big this room is, but it might fill this room in spring. And by the time I go and spread it, it's going to be 1/3 of this size. It's broken down that much. It's another reason I like it, just with the horses in terms of power, is it's so much less material. It packs the same punch, or it's got all the good stuff is still in there, but it's 1/3 of the weight and volume as it was to begin with. And so it's just a lot easier for the horses to apply at that point. Does that make sense?
I'm wondering, this is a little off the subject, but do you find that adding the addition of manure or having the manure based piles, do you find that it cuts down on rodent issues, or do you have a rodent? I just know that composting vegetables is essential.
Oh, yeah. In the barn, you mean?
In the barn and then outside once you do the pile.
The pile's in the barn, so it's all happening in the barn. So, I have a cat, but also all the food waste is going into the chicken pen, which is giant, because I want to give them room to move around, but it's not this typical setup of like a house and a run. They just have a big covered section of the barn that they're in winter. They free range when there's something to eat, but in winter they don't. So the food scraps I just throw into the chicken pen. They're on the surface. And the chickens do a lot of cleaning up, basically, of any stray stuff. So I don't think there's much actual food left for rodents, if that makes sense. There are things they don't eat. I certainly have seen mice and rats, but it's not a problem. It's not like, I don't know. The only place I've struggled with them is in the storage containers for vegetables, where I've had to set traps. But that's because there's a lot of food in there, and there's no cats in there. But yeah, I guess if they're not bothering you, who cares? You know what I mean? Or like, I don't know, they seem fine, basically. They're gross. I'm like not into them either. But I figure if I see a rat or a mouse in the barn, I hope the cat gets it. If not, so be it. But that might, that might just be the size of this barn also, I think, is part of what makes all this possible. And this is a grant that funded this like big hoop barn that really changed things. And it's true that like in the old barn that we had, which was a falling down dairy barn, the rodent thing just seemed grosser. There was just nooks and crannies, and you just knew they were like in the old stone wall. And but yeah, if you really think a little bit further, it's like, well, I don't know, are they stealing some chicken food? Is it like $2 a month? I don't know.
That they're not so bad. Farmers probably
Right.
they're not terrible.
Right. Cats. Cats are great.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
See, you have the horses on this big like,
Bedded pack.
Yeah, and they don't have like hoof problems or like sort of being on that moist, warm thing in the winter is fine.
No, that's a good question. So, you want to keep the surface of it dry. And the good thing about bedding is, everybody talks about the carbon to nitrogen ratio, wanting to be 1 to 20 or whatever. I think that's true when you're getting started and you need to get your fertility up. To my mind, at this point, I just want as much carbon as possible. So I'm happy to put more bedding down whenever.
So you're watering it, but keeping the top dry.
Oh, the watering only happens after it's in the pile.
Oh, okay.
I would never, no. I'm trying to keep it as dry as possible while the animals are living on it. They go away in spring. I come in with the skid steer. I make a big pile. As it heats up, it's going to steam. You see it steaming. It's losing a lot of moisture. And at some point, it's going to be kind of dry, so I water the pile. But yes, I would never. No, I'm trying to keep it dry. And a nice thing about horses is, just their manure is naturally fairly dry, as opposed to the dairy cow requires 5 times as much bedding. Also, they're laying down all the time. Gross. But yeah, so regular addition of wood chips or whatever other bedding they won't eat to keep their feet dry. But exercise, what they want is to get out and get their feet. My horses are not shod, and so part of they're on the road. They're on the hardtop road either for exercise or to go to my dad's or because we're out having fun. And I think that really helps foot health. They're also Suffolks, and they just don't, they have nice feet. But yeah, last time the farrier was there, he looked at their feet and left. So they're getting trimmed maybe once a year.
Because you're working so much, it's just kind of wearing it.
Right.
Okay.
So we think of like how they evolved. They probably didn't need a farrier. Some of them probably did. But yeah, getting their feet scraping against stones or on hard pavement, which you can overdo that. But some of that's really nice to just to wear those edges off. And so if I haven't been using them a lot, like in winter, I will intentionally choose a route that involves a couple miles of pavement. And I actually don't start on it though, because I think the hoof is a little bit soft after like your fingers pruning after a bath. I think their hoof is a little bit soft coming off the bedded pack and standing in their stall and whatever. So I want to be on dry ground for half an hour or whatever before. I don't want to go from a week of standing in that to all of a sudden I'm on the pavement. That might be superstition. Cool. So harrows are cool. Harrows have tines that are shaped like this, and they sort of go through and move the soil in a gentler way than the discs for sure. And they tend to have like a smoothing effect. They're great for ripping out weeds, and they're nice for incorporating the manure. And harrows are definitely something you can find. I use with the single horse, just a smaller section. So the way harrows are built is actually in sections that get bolted together. So I have 2 sections bolted together. If I had 1 horse, I would unbolt it, and then I would have 2 harrows. And this can be traditionally as a loose pull, meaning there is no pole at all. You just have the traces attached to the double tree or the single tree if it's a single horse. And then there's a chain in the front of the harrows that just gets connected to that with a clevis pin. And so you're walking and driving, and the harrows is in front of you, the horses are in front of that, and you're just walking behind it as it smooths the soil. But what I usually do is also attach the harrows to the forecart And that's because I like to harrow at high speeds, like a trot. First of all, because I'm trying to get it done. And second, the faster the harrows moves, the more effective it seems to be. And you can just kind of imagine it's the difference between sort of like brushing your hand over the soil like this and going like that. I don't know exactly why. It just is more effective. And so we like to like really do it. So we make our turn at the beginning, or out in the headlands, and when we get back when we're harrowing, they know just what to do when we get back into the field. And they get the command to go. If the harrows are behind them, they know that means like really go. So that's something that's.
Do you feel like you've got more of a connection to the horses then if you're in the forecourt versus if you're ground driving them with the harrow in front of you and then the horse?
That's a good question. I'm definitely closer to them, so that's nice.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have more of a connection. I mean, I often will teach people how to drive with the harrows without the forecart. I always start on the forecart, but teaching people how to ground drive with the harrow, it's just a sort of different set of skills a little bit. It can be tricky because you're walking at this point in pretty soft soil because it's been disked, and now you're harrowing it. So, you're kind of, it's like walking on the beach a little bit. Your feet are definitely sinking in as you go through. And so, yeah, I'm doing it the American way. I'm like, well, instead of all that walking, I'll sit on this thing. But both options are good. And as opposed to, you couldn't do a loose hitch like that. You have to have a pole if it's something on wheels like the manure spreader. Because if there was a downward slope at all, the spreader would just come smack them in the butt. So you have to have something to hold that back. Whereas the harrows, because they're in the ground, whenever the horse stops, the harrow stops. It's never going to move on its own, even on a steep slope, because it's like grabbing in. Yes. So that's a single horse thing, or easily adaptable. And then bed shape. So the harrows is also a 4-cart. And from here on out, I pretty much retire the 4-cart, and I move to something called the cultivator, which is in this little video. Who wants the password? So this is not on that screen, of course, because there's so few of us. This happens to be harvesting potatoes just because, but, whoops, how do I pause? I can't. This piece of equipment is the cultivator. So it's got 2 big steel wheels. And it's a lot like, for some reason, there we go. It's got these 2 big steel wheels. They're 36 inches apart. In between, down here, are these like metal bars that you can attach a number of different tools to. And there's levers right up here, so at the end of the row you can lift the tools out of the ground, you make your turn and come back and put them back down. This also has foot steering, so you can turn those wheels with your feet. The horses are determining ultimately your major steering. You can't like zoom all the way around with it. But you're going to be able to weed with this. You're going to be able to move really effectively about 3 inches in either direction. So you can correct for one horse getting a little in front of the other, or stepping out of the roll all of a sudden. The foot steering is really critical. So there's two different sides to there's two different gangs, they're called, that you can attach things to, and each one has its own lever. So I'm mostly farming on a slope, and for that reason, I can choose to put these tines in a little shallower and these tines in a little deeper. You can also adjust the angle of the pole so that you can make your front tines dig in deeper or shallower, or vice versa. So this is the coolest machine. They didn't start to make these until after the Civil War, and then they stopped making them, after tractor stuff came in. So like in the 20s, I think was probably the last one. This would have been one of those last machines that was made, but it's probably turning 100 sometime soon. This actual piece of equipment, I got it from someone. We had to chainsaw a sapling that had grown up through it. It was like in their back of their yard, and we greased it up, and it works, which is amazing. So a lot of my equipment is like that. Some of it I don't even, could be 150 years old. I have no idea. But this was the height of this technology, and it is as sensitive as pretty much any other weeder that you can find on a tractor farm. So it's called a straddle row cultivator or a 2-row cultivator. The wheelbase is adjustable. You can move those wheels in or out. It's sort of annoying, but you can do it. Mine are set at 36 inches. So all my paths, are 36 inches from center to center, and all my bed tops are 36 inches from center to center. Everything's laid out the same way. It's not worth it to me to have a different system. For some crops probably could grow a little closer, but it would be silly. I'd have to make all kinds of adjustments while I was in the field. So this is just one thing. And what I do to start, if you look down here, this is called a potato plow sometimes. It's also called a middle buster, or it's called a 12-inch shovel. I don't think you get to see him put it down. This is Butch driving, not me. It's already down when we start. So can you see that this shovel is making a furrow down the middle? What it's doing here is popping out potatoes. If you can see them falling to the bottom of that furrow. But what I do when I make my beds is I have a second one of those, and they're behind the wheels. So they're kind of doing the opposite of making a furrow down the middle. They're making a furrow in the paths. It creates a raised bed. Make sense? Yeah. Cool. That was a critical innovation for me. It was the thing I struggled most with when I had a single horse. Because the thing about this is, I'll make one I'll go the garlic from, in this spring, I'll go to the garlic that I planted and it's come up. One horse is going to stand on one side of the garlic, the other one's on the other side of the garlic. My wheels are there, the garlic is right here between me, so I can see what I'm doing. I'll put the shovels down, and it's going to make those 2 furrows. And now we turn around, and we come back, and this shovel is in that furrow. And this shovel is making a new furrow. So my beds are perfectly parallel. The next bed is perfectly parallel. The next bed is perfectly parallel. And we continue down the field that way. With a single horse, she would be walking on the bed if you had this piece of equipment. So the person I got this from actually had adapted it so that it was offset, as he was using a single horse, and so she could walk in the path, and he was over here. His name is Ben. He has a grain CSA. If anyone's interested, you can email me and I'll try to track him down. I haven't talked to him in a few years. So it seems like it's doable. My guess is on a slope like this, it wouldn't be. There's just too much slop, I would imagine. With one horse, it's offset from the draft. And there's going to be some draft issues anyway, because it's going to be wanting to kind of tweak on her, because all the drag is going to be on one side of her. I say her because these are 2 mares, but obviously they have both flavors.
Do 2 mares get along with each other?
They do. They get on great. I've heard of problems, but I haven't had them. Have you had them?
I think 2 horses.
But you have 3 horses.
Yeah.
If you had 2, they might love each other. I think 3 is dynamic.
Even two.
It was. So also, what happens in harness and what happens in the barn or on pasture is so different. You know what I mean? You like never know what the relationship's going to be when they're in harness. I would say, they get along great in harness, but they are probably, Trixie is annoyed with Polly in harness a fair amount, whereas you never see that irritation in the pasture. Trixie's she's like, Polly's just a little more like, oh, what? Trixie's like, that way, go down. She'll like kind of smack her with her head. But not if they get on great. It's not enough to bother me though. So this is an issue with single horses. What you can do is use a single horse walking cultivator, which you can find in people's yards all the time. It's got those 2 curved handles and kind of a V-shaped metal thing on the bottom. Does this ring a bell to anybody who's seen these around? That's basically that came before this and existed for 100 or more years before this. I don't actually know. And that's basically a single gang of this. So instead of being on both sides of the crop, you're walking in the path. The horse is walking on the path, and you are operating between these 2 rows of crops rather than over the crop. There's no question this is a superior tool. It's way, way better. But they do make these now, and you can fabricate one yourself easily with kind of just like for a push seeder, with a kind of guide that would make a tiny furrow 36 inches or 24 inches, whatever you want it to do, in that direction. So you could attach a potato plow to this thing, have your horse walk a single walk ahead of you, marking where the next one was going to be, and then come back and hit that one, marking it, flip your marker the other way, and you could go back and forth that way. So it's doable. It's just a little sloppy and irritating. On flat ground, it would be less irritating, and in a sandier soil, it would be less irritating. This tends to, the line kind of wags around. It'll hit a rock. There's just a stiffer soil than sand, and so that kind of row marking has never been very successful for me. But yeah, so this piece of equipment really did. I would say the reason I'm using a team now rather than a single is largely about this piece of equipment, which really changed my whole system once we got it. So for the bed shaping, I'm using. This is all going to be cultivator stuff now. Another bed marker. For the bed shaping, I have the 2, we can call them whatever we want, 2 middle busters. And a steel plate that's just got 2 ropes on it that are tied to the back of this cultivator, and it just smooths the bed top. It's enough to smooth the bed top. There's another soil thing. I watched David Fisher do this before I got one, and he's got sandy soil, and he was using a 2x8, and I came home and put a 2x8 on the back of my cultivator, and nothing happened. It was just like, it was as if I nailed another 2x8 on it, and then another one, until I had this giant dragging mess. I was kind of doing it, but not really, and it finally occurred to me, I just need real weight to move my heavy soil around. And so that steel plate probably weighs 40 pounds. And it's, an inch thick, 8 inches wide, and 30 inches long probably. And so, that sits on the back, and that makes a nice, smooth bed top. Then, I put down drip tape and furrow wherever or furrow depending on the crop. So not every crop gets drip tape. I hate it because it's so much plastic. I can't reuse it. There's no good way for me to take it up thousands of linear feet. I used to try to save it, and it was like a nightmare. And so I throw it away at the end of the year. It kind of kills me every year, and I'd love to not do it. And some years, the moisture is good, and I don't even turn it on. And so I'm throwing away something I never even used. On the other hand, there's been enough years now where turning it on has saved a crop or has doubled the yield probably, that like on my high value stuff especially, I'm always going to put it in. On my small seeded stuff, carrots and beets, and carrots is so, a big portion of what we do, and that's just drip, drip, drip. Alliums, no. Corn, no. Cucurbits, yes. Solanacea, yes. Brassicas, yes. Carrots, yes. Beets, yes. So, more than half my field is getting drip tape. And the drip tape is below the surface of the soil. I think everybody should do this, whether they're horses or tractor-based, rather than putting it on the soil surface, because it's not in the way of cultivating later. So whether it's by hand or horse or tractor, you don't have to worry about tearing it up, because it's not, you're not going to hoe it by mistake, you're not going to catch on it or whatever. It's just nicely under the soil surface where you don't have to worry about it. If you have a leak, you'll know, because you'll see a big wet pool. So that's not really the problem. I don't know why it's not. Plenty of people do it, but most vegetable growers I know don't do it, and I'm a big fan of it. You have to make your own attachment for this. Basically, you can use the cultivator accepts the sort of shank that fits in and gets screwed in for all the different attachments that you might put in is the same diameter as black pipe, like gas black pipe that you can get at any hardware store. 3/4 inch black pipe is good enough for pretty much all this. And so that fits into the two holders that come on this cultivator. This may be an unnecessary amount of information for you guys. I don't know. I'm going to say it anyway. So this is holding this pipe onto the frame of that cultivator. And then there is a piece of steel welded across those two upright posts, and attached to this, it's going to be easier to draw it over here so this is looking from the back of the cultivator, and now we're going to look at the side of it. This is an open tube. Uh-oh. Well, you get the point. How does that go? Something like that. And I just welded a curved tine on here. That's the most commonly used kind of tine for weeding. So it's got a triangular point on it that digs into the soil, and it has a curve to it. So this is welded to this 2-inch tube, and I have another one of these setups on the back that has the roll of drip tape on it, and the drip tape then goes from this roll through the top of the tube and out the bottom. So this tine is going to tear a little, is going to go in front of the drip tape coming out, and is going to tear a little hole, a little groove in the soil, and your drip tape's going to just lay in there. It's like even, it's just super smooth and easy. The water flows through it really nicely, and this is protecting your drip tape from any stones or anything. So if you tried to just shove this down in the ground and run your drip tape out, every time you hit a stone, it would tear your drip, and you'd have a hole or whatever. This tine is going to protect your tape because you're traveling in this direction. So this tine protects your tape as it comes out, and it gets sort of laid in the bottom of the trench like that as you go forward. if anybody's interested in making it or knowing more about it, I could say lots more. I have pictures actually. It was not worth trying to find.
Is the pipe down as low as the tine, or is it like hovering above the soil, or do you have it like the pipe itself? Like, do you have that lowered into the soil to dispense the tape, or is it just kind of like?
It depends on how deep I'm going to. So different crops, I might do different things. If it's carrots, I'm probably going to be using the drip tape to germinate them. So I'm only going to go. The soil surface is probably going to be like here.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be putting in tomato transplants, where I'm going to try to bury some of the stems, so I actually want to go, deep. It might be here. So it doesn't really matter because this tube is going to follow that tine no matter what. So you can run it down into the soil, and you don't need to. It's pretty forgiving that way. Yes. Good. If I don't want to put drip tape down in the row, I don't attach this, and I run this exact same thing anyway because it makes a nice furrow to transplant into. And so that's going to just mark the middle of my row. And when I go put in transplants, I'm not like shoveling around. And often, if it's going to be a row with transplants, I might run this without drip tape once, really deep, to just get a nice, big, soft groove to transplant it to, and then come back and put my drip tape and actually run the drip tape out in there. Maybe a little bit shallower, or just to make those two passes to kind of really loosen up what's in that central furrow, and it makes transplanting a dream. So
transplanting by hand at that point?
we totally everything's by hand. I've looked at they make transplanters for horses. We don't have enough to justify it, and we do so many different crops that I think, if you're going to do 5 acres of one thing, you load up all your trays, then you might justify the price of having this other piece of equipment around. But for us, it's like, if you do a nice job preparing that furrow, it's that fast. It should take, I can put in, 2 people can do like 1,000 transplants in half hour to 45 minutes. With a dropper and a barrier. But really, it should be like, that fast. At Essex Farm, he had great disdain for transplanters because he had worked on some big vegetable production farms in California with Mexican guys who he was like they just turn their bodies into machines. So just stop whining about it and get down and just become a machine until you get to the end of the row, and then you stand up and take a little break. But just don't. It's not supposed to be you're not patting them in and making sure that each one. You're just getting them in the soil. Whether they get dripped or not, there's this furrow being formed. So the row then needs to be smoothed again if it's a direct seeded crop, and it doesn't need to be if it's going to be transplanted. So from this direction, after this point, I'm now differentiating row by row, are you getting transplanted or direct seeded? If it's going to get direct seeded, I smooth that top, and I'm going to come back and flame it as soon as I see weeds forming. Some of these I try to do all of this basically at once in the beginning of the season. So by late May, all my rows are made. But some of those, like carrots, aren't going to get planted for a month. So the bed's going to be sitting in place, ready to go for a full month. I'm going to try to not touch it again so I don't bring any more weeds to the surface. And what I do is I flame weed that bed top whenever it needs it, every week, every 2 weeks. And that's just a tank of propane and a hiking backpack with a big wand. And it's just enough heat to boil the weeds. You don't want to let them get that big. You want to let them get that big. And if they're small enough, you should be able to keep up a regular walking pace walk down your row and just kind of roughly flame it. It's just really nice for weed control. And from there, you're going to seed your crop. If you've transplanted, and then from here or from here, your next step is to cultivate. Which is going to be by horse mostly, but also by hand, and also by flame. I'm kind of into the flame weeder for you can full on flame alliums and corn because their growing tip is insulated. So you can have onion seedlings that are this big and blast them with the flame weeder. And it's just a nice alternative. I cultivate with the horses mostly, but I sometimes will just sort of switch it up. If most of my weeds that are in the onion or corn row are just right around that transplant, because I was able to get what was along, but I can't. It's like sort of fussy. The flame weeder is great. You can come through and you can actually cover the whole area really nicely. So I sort of I'll go back and forth. I'll do one week and one the next week, and I just sort of choose. Also, Market Essex Farm said hand weeding was just a failure of good planning, basically. If you find that you're hand weeding, it's because you didn't do a good enough job getting everything ready for your crop. And although I still do plenty of hand weeding, I keep it in mind, and I feel like a failure while I'm hand weeding. I figure every row is going to need one cultivation by hand. There's just going to be some things that get missed, and there's no instrument as sensitive as your hands, or your hoe or whatever. But just really, looking at each square foot of the garden as you go down. But I really don't want to do it more than once. And when I do it, I should be walking along looking for weeds, not weeding out weeds. I should be seeing some weeds that get removed. And making sure that happens is a lot about this bear fallow, incorporating that into your rotation over the course of years. It's also about getting these rows prepped early, so that you have time to come through and kill weeds before your crop is in there, because that's always going to be just the fastest, easiest thing to do. And then it's also just staying on top of the horse cultivation, so going out there and cultivating rows that really don't look like they need to be cultivated. You're there's hardly any weeds here. That's perfect. It's time to weed. So that the same cultivator, you're just setting up tines. It totally depends on the crop and how big it's gotten. I could go on and on and on about various setups for different times and different crops, but basically, you're going to have a series of different tines that you bolt onto the frame of that cultivator, and you can get very you can really be very particular about how close you're getting to the crop, and you can use that foot steering so that your tines are really running, if that's your crop, your tines are right here, and you can use your foot steering to move that along. It's like a video game or something. It has you get to the end of the row, you look up, you're like, oh. But yeah, and so the single row cultivator would be a walking cultivator. One crop would be here, one crop would be here, and you can very easily adjust the width of it as you go. I used to try to do both sides at once, basically, and then I realized that I actually needed to just focus on one. If these are your two rows, you're just focusing on this row as you go down, so you narrow it enough that you're not going to hit this crop, and you're really just focused on this edge. And then you come back down, and you're really just focused on this edge. So it's twice as much work as this single row cultivator, because to do, because you're only doing half of each bed at a time. This half, then this half, then this half, as opposed to doing both sides of each one. On the other hand, it's really fun because you're back there. It can be just as effective on the piece that you're actually working on, because you can steer it really easily with your hands as you're walking. And when we started, it was a two-person deal. There was someone steering, and there was someone using the cultivator. Your horse needs to be really well trained if you're going to throw the lines over your shoulder and just use the cultivator. They want to stay in those paths. I mean, they really want to walk in an established track. They're not going to naturally want to step on crops. It's more a speed issue. So if the horse starts walking faster than it's comfortable for you to walk and steer this thing, which is also their natural tendency if you're not on the lines at all, it can just be a real, just a sort of harrowing experience. It just like doesn't feel good. So it's kind of nice having somebody walk one row over with the lines. They're totally out of the cultivator's way, so they're offset from the horse. They're 3 feet off to the side, but who cares? And they're walking along, just keeping a nice, easy pace for the person who's doing the cultivating. Let's see. So now we're at under sowing. Right, so then after cultivation, either things get undersown once the weeds are under control. So let's say it's like mid-July. Oh, great.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Time's up. You guys up for another 3 minutes, and then I'll be done with this one. So by mid-July, I've probably cultivated the onions like 8 times or something with the horses, and maybe I've flamed it a couple times. I'm waiting to get a rain and a day or two of heat and not see new things sprouting. And at that point, I'm like, great, I can put down my clover. You walk through the row, you crank in your clover, and now you're done. You do not touch that row again. You do nothing in that row until harvest time. So that's one case. And from there, you harvest. Or you go straight to harvest, like in the case of carrots and beets, and then it goes into rye. And yeah, I guess so. The final note, as you saw, I also use that cultivator and move the shovel to the middle to harvest potatoes, for example. You could also use it with a tine that's offset to make a furrow like next to leeks, for example, and then pull them out into that furrow. But most things get pulled out by hand and loaded onto a flat trailer that hooks onto the forecart, but with a ball on the back. Instead of the drop-in hitch, it's got a ball that accepts any trailer that you could buy anywhere. And that trailer is really nice for just moving stuff around the farm, for giving people rides, and it's just easy to hook up and drag around. And you can put thousands of pounds of stuff on there, and they can pull it through the field no problem. The end. I didn't leave any time for questions. I guess we did some as we went. I'm happy to sit here.
If you guys kind of what the minimum plot size would be to, I don't know, make this
worthwhile.
Yeah, worthwhile.
That's a good question. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, at what point would you say to yourself, I could be doing this by hand.
Right.
Why am I? Or I could get a VCS and not buy all this equipment. I mean, I think on a half acre, you would be happy to be doing it this way rather than by hand. The cost would be another question, which is all right, well, what of these things can you do without You know, maybe you spread on a half acre. Maybe you spread manure out of the back of a truck. Maybe.
But I guess if it's meant to be a hobby, then I mean most hobbies are money pits anyway. So.
Right. Totally. Although this might be. Yeah, I think you would just have to think, what can I eliminate?
Yeah.
Because there's also maintenance on all the equipment. It's not a lot because it's simple, but you know, it's not nothing. So yeah, I feel like at a half acre, there's room for the horses to move. You're not trying to maximize what you can grow in that space anymore. I mean, I think a big issue with most home gardens is like there's not room for a horse to be in that system because you're trying to, every square foot is, you know. So maybe even a quarter acre, but I feel like certainly at a half acre you'd be like, there's more soil here than I can move around, and I'm really happy that I have help to do that, and it's enough work that my horse is getting out once or twice a week, so that we're like, they're staying in
You're
practice.
spending the majority of the time turning back around because you get the end of your row in 10 seconds. Now it's
Right. So this is something I didn't talk about, but if you're laying stuff out for horses, the longer the row, the better.
Yeah.
The shape of your field would ideally be,
That's right.
yeah, because turning, all your time is in turning. The flip side is, you want to keep crops of a similar habit within that row. So if you wind up with sunflowers and beans, you're going to wish you could cultivate those beans again, but the sunflowers might get in your way. That's with like a straddle row clover. Or you've got a tomatillo plant in there, and there's a bunch of parsley leading up to it, and all of a sudden, you know, you're going, and all of a sudden the tomatillo, you know, growing all over the pathway. So, you know, grouping like things. I mean, I only plant basically one crop per row for that exact reason. I just want to be able to manage each row the same way. But like in that half acre piece for ourselves, I do switch things up sometimes and have weird stuff in rows that I kind of regret, but like it doesn't not work. It's just a little more irritating. But yeah, on a home scale, I think it would be like, that'd just be part of it. You're like, oh. Yeah. Cool.